Hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Celtic Way Sit Down. I'm Aidan Macdonald, and today I'm joined by TCW columnist Kevin McKenna to discuss his top 5 favourite Celtic moments of his kind of Celtic supporting career. Kevin, how are you?
Aye, very good, Aidan. Always been looking forward to this for a wee while, talking about the top moments, watching the hoops. There was dozens of them actually. I kind of agonised over the 5 that I think kind of gave me most pleasure.
Yeah, it's always difficult, and we've did a couple of these now, and I think everybody that's been involved, from Tony himself, Tony Haggerty, our own Tony Haggerty did one. We did one with Paul Lambert. We recently had Ryan Fitzsimons on, a fellow Celtic Way content creator, and I think for each of them there was a lot of debate beforehand about what moments were going to be chosen. It isn't easy, but we thought kind of the best way to try and do these is to condense them down to 5. Just because, I'm sure every point of people could pick a top 20, a top 30, but everybody would end up just going on and on. So, yeah, this is the kind of format we've thought of sticking with. But like you say, it does take a wee bit of kind of thinking about these things. And I guess before we get into it, Kevin, if you I know one of the moments is your first game, which I'll not spoil in advance, but how long have you been kind of supporting Celtic, going to games, writing about the club, etc.?
So, I just turned 60 not long ago. So, I mean, we're talking about nearly 55 years since my first ever game, which will feature in this. I tried to kind of do a rough estimate of how many games I'd been at, but it's impossible, because there were quite a few where, especially in my younger days, where the recollections are hazy, because bad men kept insisting on buying me drink before these games. Terrible.
Indeed. So 55 years, Kevin. So many an era, obviously, kind of right back from just after the Lisbon Lions, if I'm looking correctly at this list, right through 70s, 80s, which was obviously extremely successful for Celtic. The 90s, which I'm not surprised there's not any kind of moments that are featuring from that decade, and then moving into kind of the modern era, Martin O'Neill, Strachan, Len, etc., Ange, and of course Brendan Rodgers for the second time. But I guess if we just kind of get into it from the start, Kevin. So I'd also got you an advanced email over your list of your top 5 moments for this, and the first one you went for was Celtic 4, Rangers 2 in May 1979. I'll let you kind of just take the floor with this one.
Yeah, May the 21st, 1979, to be exact. It was my first ever Celtic v Rangers game, and I was 15, and I remember it vividly, before, during, after. I think for a lot of Celtic fans, their first game against Rangers is a sort of watershed moment, and it's almost like one of those moments that, defines the passing from being a youth to an adult. Because, well, for me anyway, and I suspect this was the same with quite a lot of West of Scotland, well, a lot of Scottish Celtic supporting families, they probably waited a few years. Parents probably waited a few years before they would allow their sons and daughters to go to a Celtic Rangers game, because of just the historic connections, the kind of cultural baggage, and in the in the 60s especially, there'd been quite a lot of violence around some of these games. So sort of responsible parenting dictated that you didn't really. It was probably mothers telling dads not to take their sons and daughters to a Celtic Rangers game until they were a wee bit older. And that was certainly the case with me. But the backstory to that actual game is quite interesting, because Scotland had a very severe winter at the start of 1979, and it meant that there were no games more or less between Christmas and I think the start of March. And there were a couple. I think did Aberdeen might have done under soil heating then, or it didn't get affected as much by the weather. But all I remember is that Celtic didn't play for, the best part of 2.5 months. And the first game back, I remember, for unfortunate circumstances, it was against Aberdeen in March. Celtic beat Aberdeen 1-0 at Parkhead, and I couldn't be there because I had my first ever date taking a girl to the pictures, and I was I was actually gutted that I wasn't able to go. I'd kind of mixed up the arrangements. It should have been for an away game. And of course, the first thing, because Celtic hadn't played for ages, the first thing I'm doing after we've gone to the pictures, and I couldn't even tell you what film was we went to see. The first thing I've done is I'm looking for the wee guy selling the old Evening Times Saturday Street edition, where you get all the results. So we come out the afternoon show, and she's wanting to talk about the pictures, and the next day, and I'm sort of dashing across the road because I see a wee guy selling the paper to get the result. Delighted we won 1-0, and then I sure enough, I get the boot not long after for not being very romantic. And so Celtic were a long way behind with loads of games in hand, and as I recall, Celtic weren't playing great that season. There was still a hangover from the previous season when Celtic had finished 5th. It was Jock Stein's last season. It was probably our worst ever season in modern history, and there was still a bit of a hangover from that season. So although we had all these games in hand, and if we'd won all these games in hand, it was 4 or 5 or 6, we would have been there or thereabouts. But there weren't many Celtic fans, because of the way we'd played before the shutdown, that gave us much of a chance of winning all those games. But sure enough, it comes to May the 21st, and the game on May the 21st had originally, that was one of the games that had been postponed during the bad weather. And as we moved towards the new date, it became clear that Celtic and Rangers were neck and neck. Celtic had done enough to catch up. They'd won most of their games in hand without really setting the heather alight. And so this showdown with Rangers was becoming, it was being billed as probably the first sort of Celtic Rangers league decider in living memory. So you can imagine the excitement and the drama around all that. And what heightened the drama was that we had played Rangers just a few weeks before in a league game, which was supposed to be at Ibrox. Ibrox was getting reconstructed, so it was played at Hampden, and Hampden Rangers beat us 1-0. Hence why only a victory against Rangers would suffice. Any other result, and the league went to Rangers. I wasn't even supposed to be at the game because my dad had a couple of tickets for the original game, and he'd promised that he would take me, and then he'd had like a change of mind, and the game get cancelled. He gets rid of the tickets. So a week before it, there was no chance that I was going to be able to go. But but I had my first ever job was as an old petrol pump attendant in a petrol garage, petrol station, which, for those of you, the young, our young viewers, those were the days when somebody would come out and fill up your motor with petrol, and that's what I did. And so a week or 2 weeks before it, this guy comes into the petrol station, and he seems to be in some distress. His car's running out of petrol. He had to be in a long journey, and he'd forgotten his wallet. He didn't have any money, and I kind of knew who he was locally, and I bought his hard luck story. And he said, "Look, I'll trust me. I'll definitely come in and pay you in the next few days." So naively, I fill up his car, and the manager, the boss of the petrol station, was not a happy man. But lo and behold, this punter came in a few days later, paid the money, and he said, "Are you a Celtic fan?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, look, have these 2 tickets." And it was 2 tickets for the game. He couldn't go because of work. So I kept them until the day before the game. I didn't tell my dad because it would have given my dad too much time to think about what else he was going to do with them. And I said to him, if I could get 2 tickets for this game, would you let me go? And he said, yeah. And so I produced the 2 tickets. So he had to let me go. And it was as thrilling an occasion as I'd been led to believe. You get all the stories handed down about how special games against Rangers are, and the special, in inverted commas, atmosphere at these games. And it didn't let me down. And that wasn't just because of the result. It was just phenomenal. The electricity in the air, the spectacle of, seeing 20-odd thousand Rangers fans in the stadium close up, and the sheer wall of noise, and just this excitement of everything. Like, you could reach out and touch the tension. And of course, we win 4-2, and the match was a roller coaster because Rangers went a goal up. Celtic, as I recall, were actually playing quite well. Rangers went a goal up against the run of play. And then our winger, Johnny Doyle, who was like a kind of cult favourite of the Celtic fans because he wore his Celtic heart on a sleeve. He had some great moments, wasn't the most consistent, God bless him, but he had some great moments in a Celtic jersey, and a lot of fans identified with him. He gets himself sent off. So that's it. You're thinking, we're a goal down by a team that have just beaten us several weeks before, and, it's not going to happen. And then we just ran over the top of them. It was almost as if, there was just this collective decision. Well, right, we're just going to win this. Nothing's going to stop us. And they just started playing like men possessed. And that's I think, when the legend of Roy Aitken started, because Roy Aitken was still relatively young at that time. He could have been barely out of his 20s, if even that. And he was, he was just rampaging around. George McCluskey had a fantastic game. George was one of Celtic's most skillful players in the 80s. Why we let him go to Leeds United when he was at the peak of his powers was probably a story that needs to be told, but it was sadly too. It happened too often in that era. And Tommy Burns was in his pomp, and Tom McAdam. Was Big Tom McAdam playing? Yeah. Yeah, it was just incredible. And then Murdo MacLeod you know, what a midfield Celtic had then. Murdo McLeod topped it off, you know, because Rangers go into a 2-1 lead. After we equalise, we get 2 goals. But there's still that tension, you know, even though Celtic were playing really well, anything can happen. And literally the last minute or two, with the light fading, Murdo just picked the ball up. And like Rangers were tired, you know, to be fair to them, they'd given everything. But as I said, you know, Celtic were just too strong for them. And they were just out in their feet when Murdo got the ball, takes a couple of stripes forward and just belts it, which he was prone to do, and ends up in the back of the net, and it was just mayhem. But then, of course, you know, although it was a Monday night, we were expecting that the TV cameras would be there, so it was, right, let's get back to the car, get home, watch the highlights, and then we find out that there's been a strike by technicians at the BBC or at STV, whoever had the rights for the game, and there was absolutely no footage. And I think the only footage that you can see on YouTube or elsewhere is pretty grainy. It's been cleaned up over the years, pretty grainy, kind of all the goals. And then the conspiracy theories start, you know, which my dad was cheerfully subscribing to, because he told me that when Celtic beat Rangers 7-1 in the League Cup final in 1957, similarly, the TV pictures disappeared, and that allegedly is because there was some technician at the BBC who'd left the cap off the lens. So of course my dad's saying this only happens, you know, when it's big important games against them. Something happens, you know, it's a conspiracy. They just didn't want us to see it. But I'm told later on by people I got to know it in the media industry that this was a lightning strike that had been, well, it'd actually been planned for a while, and nothing to see here. I have my doubts. So that's just well remembered for all sorts of reasons. First Celtic Rangers game, genuine title decider between the two, and the intensity of the occasion, and the Celtic performance was memorable, and all those iconic players being there up close, magical.
Would you say that's maybe your favourite ever Celtic Rangers game, despite it being the first one? And did that give you a false sense of how they were all going to go going forward after that?
Well, after that, Rangers went through a real barren spell. I mean, they'd won the treble the season before, 77-78, when we were just mince. But between 79 and, you know, until probably the arrival of Souness in 86, they went into a real long tailspin, which also coincided with the emergence of Aberdeen and Dundee United, their best ever team. So between 79 and 86, we won 3 titles, Aberdeen won 3 titles, Dundee United won a title, Rangers were nowhere. And so, yeah, there was a kind of, you know, after a few years, because after that I went to university, and we scalped Rangers on a regular basis. So, you know, this was like seemed the natural order. You know, then Souness comes along, the Bank of Scotland gives them all this money. We didn't meet the challenge very well, and that's basically why there are no games between my favourite games happened between, well, apart from the centenary season, 87, 88, but for the next 10 years after that, you won't find too many great occasions.
I guess maybe one of the games that did break that duck would be your next moment, and it was a year later, 1980.
Yeah.
Was it a European Cup semi-final? I
European
believe
Cup,
against Real Madrid?
European Cup quarter-final.
Quarter-final. Celtic 2, Real Madrid 0, 1980. Obviously,
Yeah.
a result like that probably speaks for itself and how good it is, but I guess, do you want to break down, was that one of the first European games you'd been to, Kevin, or had you been to a few before then?
The first European game I'd been to was Celtic against Basel, or Bal, whichever way you want to pronounce it, the Swiss champions. And that was the 73-74 European Cup quarter-final at Celtic Park, and we beat them 4-2 after extra time. And then, of course, the semi-final that year was the infamous one against Atletico Madrid, where they basically kicked us off the park. But that, you could do an entire podcast in that game, I can assure you. So before 80, I'd been to the Celtic played Olympiacos, the Greeks, in 74-75. Boavista the following season, Sachsenring's Zwickau were an East German team. So I'd only been to about a handful of European games before this one. But again, this was another one that I hadn't expected to get to, because at that time I was studying, I was in a seminary, allegedly studying to be a priest, which ended after less than a year when they invited me to reconsider whether I thought this was a good idea or not. And I think I did everyone a favour by not continuing. However, that year we draw Real Madrid, and there was only 15 of us in this seminary, which was in Kilwinning of all places. Don't ask me how they pitched up in Kilwinning, but Kilwinning is where the Sacred Heart Fathers had their seminary. And so I'd said to the priests that, wouldn't it be a great idea for a sort of bonding expedition if we could get our hands on tickets for the Real Madrid game and take all the boys, who were all, although this seminary was in Kilwinning, all the lads were, most of them were from North Lanarkshire, west of Scotland, Glasgow, all mad mental Celtic boys. And so I wrote to Desmond White, who was then the Celtic chairman, on the Sacred Heart Fathers headed notepaper, and played the poor, starving seminarian card, that we were all deeply devout, pious young men, training to serve the church in the Amazon jungle, or some remote godless place, putting our lives on the line for the faith. And we'd no money because we've taken a vow of poverty, and we would absolutely, could Celtic out the goodness of their heart, and in memory of Brother Walfred, maybe send us 15 tickets for these poor starving students for the priesthood. And nobody, least of all me, thought that we'd get anywhere, but sure enough, 2 weeks later, the tickets arrived, 15 tickets for Celtic v Real Madrid. But also there was a bill of sale, so Desmond still wanted his money for the tickets, and expected to get it. So starving seminarians or not, living the vow of poverty, Celtics were still wanting the money. So we all went up in the bus, and and went to the Real Madrid game. And again, you know, Celtic had a good team, but you know, I don't think any Celtic fan who can remember that team would ever say it ranked amongst the greatest ever Celtic teams. Far from it. They had a lot of heart. Billy McNeil, you know, who'd led us to the title in the 4-2 season, had given us a lot of heart, but it wasn't the most skillful, technically adept Celtic team. But they'd loads of heart. And Real Madrid were then, as now, would have been regarded favourites to win the European Cup. And they had just signed a player from West Bromwich Albion, a really gifted black winger called Laurie Cunningham, who was just what a player. And but we win 2-0, but before we scored, Real could have scored 2 or 3. Cunningham was just in a different planet, you know, the pace that he had and just his sheer athleticism. Really intelligent player as well. And again, just as with the 4-2 game, just this spirit, just swept over them. They're up against far more skillful players. This was before the era of the super team. So, real good though Real Madrid and the likes of Barcelona and Bayern Munich and Ajax at that time, when the top English teams they weren't, they weren't spending hundreds of millions on their players. It wasn't like they're 11 superstars. So a decent team could get some of the ball. And Celtic had a decent team at that time as well. Again, for younger fans, Celtic Park on European nights was actually considered a fortress across Europe. So before 1980, so Celtic's first ever game was against Valencia in 1962 in Europe. So they'd been playing in Europe for 18 years, and until that game against Real Madrid, Celtic had only been beaten twice at home in Europe. So even the best teams would have expected to have been given a hard time by Celtic at home. And gradually, Celtic just by sheer grit, determination. But again, some really top performances, because you George McCluskey, who, as I'd said previously, was in his pomp. You had Tommy Burns, I think, with Davy Probyn, Murdo MacLeod. And we've got the goals were scored by George McCluskey and a header. This, if you ever see it again in the highlights, I think STV had the game. So the highlights, you've got the old the great old commentator Arthur Montford, and I think Ian St John was co-commentating. And this flying header by Johnny Doyle, who wasn't very tall. I'd never seen him score a headed goal in my life. And suddenly we're 2-0 up against the mighty Real Madrid. And we could have scored a third. And the crowd was 67,000. That was the capacity. That was the ground capacity. Unforgettable experience. I'd pre-arranged before the game to meet up with some of my dodgier pals from before I'd gone to study to take holy orders. So we had pre-arranged a place, like one of the numbered sort of exits in the jungle. And at that time, you could freely move between the Celtic end and the jungle. So I'd sort of conveniently lost, in inverted commas, my fellow seminarians at half-time, and arranged to meet these guys in the jungle, and they'd had a couple of half bottles. And also we could swear our heads off. So obviously we're not swearing in the Celtic end with the seminarians and Father Walsh and Father Grant been there, but we could swear our heads off with them safely in the Celtic end, and me being in the jungle and having a wee fly swig before I kind of conveniently met up with my holy friends. So brilliant night, great trip back down to Kilwinning. But we get beat 3-0 in the second leg, which is another game, actually. We were nothing each right in the stroke of half-time, and George McCluskey missed a 1-on-1 chance. Well, it was 0-0 in the Bernabeu, and we would have won. We'd have been through the semis, but Real Madrid ran away with it, 1-3-0. But not that many Scottish football fans. I know Aberdeen fans will say they beat Real Madrid in 1983, but that was a crap Real Madrid team. We softened them up for the Dons.
I think it's interesting, Kevin, to also think about your point on, even though these teams were obviously very good at that time, Real Madrid, all your English sides, Ajax, they did have excellent players, and they probably were favourites for the European Cup, as they are most seasons still nowadays for the Champions League. Obviously, Man City won it the season just past, but Real Madrid won it in 2022. But, there was one-off games where Celtic could get at teams like that, or even across two legs, whereas now it does feel like that the gap's so big, financially, it just, we don't need to go into it too much, but it just feels like it's a million miles away. But
I mean, that year in 1980, Nottingham Forest won the European Cup by beating Hamburg. In the previous year, Nottingham Forest had won it by beating Malmo. And in 1982, 2 years later, Aston Villa won it by beating Bayern Munich. Now, Nottingham Forest had a magnificent manager in Brian Clough. But at that point, having a good coach, an inspirational coach, and having a good strategy and a good structure, you could have a chance of beating the superstars. But that doesn't happen now. There's next to no chance of any club out with the top 2 or 3 from Germany, Italy, Spain, or England winning the Champions League. You could basically bet your house and have a good chance of winning by predicting who the 4 semi-finalists will be in next season's Champions League. But as you said, that's another chapter in itself.
Indeed. But obviously a phenomenal night for Celtic in Europe, even though it didn't work out overall in the ties. A sort of one-off memory. I can only imagine what it'd be like to see Celtic beat Real Madrid in a game like that, Kevin. But moving on to domestic duties now, which is a few years later, we're moving to 1998. Obviously the centenary season, Celtic beat Dundee United 2-1 in the Scottish Cup final to win the tournament that year. Is that sort of another memory, Kevin, that lives on in the memory? I know personally, like my own family, my dad will regularly talk about that game. It's been one of his all-time favourites, despite it not being Rangers in a final. Am I right in saying that Celtic defeat Rangers in the semi-final to get to the final?
In the semi-final we beat Hearts 2-1. But in both the semi-final and the final, Celtic scored in the last couple of minutes. In fact, against Hearts in the semi-final, we were a goal down with 3 minutes to go, and we scored 2 in the last 3 minutes to get to the final. Yeah, the centenary season was great because, yeah, it's a centenary season, but at the start of the season, Celtic would not have been considered anywhere near the favourites because Rangers had won the title quite straightforwardly the previous year, buying in English internationals. Graham Souness was player manager. And Celtic's response was, so Billy McNeill came in as manager, and we bought Andy Walker from Motherwell, Big Mick McCarthy, centre half from Manchester City, I think. Chris Morris, again an Englishman but an Irish international, at fullback, and then Billy Stark, who out of all those four was the cheapest, because I think he was 32 by then and he'd been released by Aberdeen with his years, his best years seemingly behind him. And there was a story that Billy McNeill told a few years later that Billy Stark was actually the first signing, but he held back from announcing it because he thought the Celtic fans would be disappointed that their first signing in this special year to try and combat Rangers' dominance the year before was a £100,000 purchase, kind of off-cut from Aberdeen. So he waited until he'd spent more serious money on Walker and McCarthy before announcing that he'd signed Billy Stark. But all of them were great that season. But Billy Stark just gave us something excellent. He was outstanding that entire season, and he scored. So we beat Rangers in the opening derby of the season, and Stark scored with a really sweet finish, and Celtic won 1-0. And after that, we kind of started believing that this could be our year. But then again, the team was very good, but again, it wasn't technically brilliant. Lot of heart, because that was a hallmark of Billy McNeill's teams, because he imbued his passion for Celtic and his success at Celtic. So no matter what else Celtic would have, they had loads of heart. But there was skill. Tommy Burns was playing great, and then and Andy Walker was a fine striker. Paul McStay, outstanding. Paul McStay won Player of the Year that season. And then we signed Frank McAvenny, I think in October that season, from West Ham for, anything in those days, like, there was all sorts of it was never ever verified exactly how much, but it was something in the region of 800 grand, which was Celtic's record signing. And that's the first time I remember thinking, God, Celtic mean business. This is, that's the sort of money you would expect Rangers or big English clubs to pay. But Celtic never, you would never imagine Celtic would pay. They just didn't pay that sort of money. So they buy Frankie Boy, and then the following month they bought Joe Miller from Aberdeen. And that was another statement signing, because he was outstanding for Aberdeen, and he'd run riot against us a few times. And then, from November, after we'd had a bit of a stutter, September, October, November onwards, we just won. We were just winning everything. But a hallmark of that season was, and ask anyone who remembers watching it, was the amount of last-minute goals Celtic scored in that centenary season was incredible. I've never seen anything before or since that matches it, the amount of last-minute goals we got. And we won the league comfortably, with, several weeks to spare. So then it's all eyes on the cup. Wouldn't it be great to win a double in our centenary year? And we've got Hearts in the semi-final. We didn't play very well. Hearts had their top team. They go into a 1-goal lead. Celtic, put them under a lot of pressure, but you couldn't really see where a goal was coming from. And then up pops Mark McGee and Andy Walker. Last 3 minutes, we're in the final. And then Dundee United, gorgeous day at Hampden. You're thinking, well, we beat Dundee United in 85. We beat them in 74 in the Scottish Cup finals. It's going to be our day. But again, Dundee United had a cracking team. And they had a great first half and scored a really good goal. I think it was Kevin Gallagher scored an absolute belter of a goal. But again, Paul McStay was just amazing. Peter Grant had his best ever season in a Celtic jersey that season. Not the most technically gifted of midfielders, divided supporters' opinion, but like Johnny Doyle, God rest him, his passion for the hoops was evident for all to see. And the last half an hour, again, Celtic just weren't going to be denied this collective spirit. And McAvenny just popped up with those 2 opportunistic goals. And so winning the double, winning the cup, Billy McNeil, first season, who'd won a European Cup. Hampden was bathed in sun. Glorious, absolutely glorious. But I've seen Celtic win the Scottish Cup quite a few times, been fortunate enough to see them. But that's probably the outstanding one. Although the Riot Cup final in 1980 was quite memorable for all sorts of reasons. But that was the outstanding one in 88.
I think it is always those, and obviously I've only ever kind of seen the highlights, but it's always defined by a really nice day, as you pointed out. And I think, is it when Tommy Burns is on the pitch and he gives the sort of they're always there. Famous, speech that I know probably everybody watching this and listening to it.
That year, he was outstanding that season. Paul McStay won Player of the Year, probably deservedly, but Tommy Burns could easily have won it. But then so could Frank McAvenny, so could Andy Walker have. I mean, we finished comfortably ahead of a superb Rangers team.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, as you're saying, Rangers were very strong at that time and they were going back and forth. So the fact that you walk away with a double that year was a momentous achievement. And probably the fact that it was the centenary year makes it even more special. And as I say, like, I've got older family members that regularly talk about that season, that cup final, that league campaign is amongst their favourites. And yeah, it's phenomenal. When you look back at the footage, you see the sort of sea of fans when that winning goal goes in, the massive end at Hampden. It's really great, and deserved place on this list, Kevin. To move on to the next one, so we go 18 years later. It's I've got my maths right there. Yep, 18 years. 2006 Celtic defeat Manchester United 1-0 at Parkhead in the Champions League group stages to secure a qualification for the last 16, which I believe that was the first time Celtic had kind of reached the sort of out of the group stages into the last 16 since the Champions League was like reformatted in 1992. Yeah. So, I think you kind of look back at that footage, and at the time, the commentators aren't always entirely sure whether or not Celtic have qualified. I believe it was in a group with Benfica and Copenhagen. Celtic had defeated Copenhagen at home, they defeated Benfica at home, and also subsequently Manchester United, but they'd lost the 3 away games, sorry, I should say. And there was also, as a notable mention, there was a memorable 3-2 game down at Old Trafford where Nakamura also scored the other free kick that people do forget about, which was a very good finish, we should say. Not quite maybe to the level of the one we'll discuss shortly, but still a good goal. So, yeah, I guess going into that night, Kevin, how were you feeling? Manchester United at that time, I believe they were the champions England, or they definitely won the league at the end of that season anyway. Can't remember if they were champions England.
So Manchester, that was 2005-06. So Manchester United,
might have been Chelsea that were the champions at
I
that,
think
that season.
Chelsea won it. Yeah, Chelsea won it in 2000 and Man U won it in 2003, Arsenal 2004, Chelsea won it in 2005 and 2006, and then Man U won 3 in a row, 2007, 8 and 9. So yeah, Chelsea were the champions, but Man U, I think, had been second, and we're playing against a Man United team who had. So they won the European Cup in 1999. They won, let me think, they won something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That squad, and I know Alex Ferguson, renewed it, but at that time, Man United had won the title 9, 10 times. In 14, 15 years. They were probably the greatest team ever assembled in English football. That squad over that period. I know people will say Manchester City playing different next level football, but Manchester City are just a vanity boutique project. I just can't take them seriously as a football club. We know where the money comes from. I mean, if you can't do well, I mean, there's half a dozen Scottish third division managers that would fancy their chances with the advantages that they've had. So I don't really take them seriously as a football club, but Manchester United are a proper football club. The money that they had earned by their success, by their charisma over the years, and there were as many homegrown players, homegrown heroes as there were superstars. But what superstars? So they, up against us that night. I'm watching. I'm looking at the teams before the game, and there's Wayne Rooney, there's Cristiano Ronaldo, you get Beckham, you get Scholes, Paul Scholes, what a player he was, Rio Ferdinand. But what gave me a bit of hope was that I'd been at Old Trafford for the first game, where they beat us 3-2, and I mean, I'll be honest, I thought we'd get horsed. And Celtic gave a really good account of themselves that night. They scored 2 excellent goals. Jan Bennegoor of Castlemilk, Jan Bennegoor of Hesselink scored the other one. And, Celtic played really well at Old Trafford against, as I said, this mighty football club. And that, as I recall, I mean, I'd had a few swillettes, I'll admit, but as I recall, Celtic finished the last 10, 15 minutes in the front foot, and we're looking for the equaliser. But Man United, when they came to Parkhead, they had just got better. You could find that in the Champions League. The big, mighty, powerful clubs just get better and better as the competition proceeds. So Man United just hit Celtic with everything in that game at Parkhead. I think we had only 18, 19% possession, maybe. And again, you're thinking there's no, if we get a draw out of this, we're doing well. But for all, I do remember, for all the possession Manchester United had, they weren't creating a lot of, a lot of clear-cut, outstanding heart attack chances. Plus, we had Artur Boric in goal, the holy goalie, who was saving everything. And Big Artur was one of those players who, the bigger the occasion, the more chilled he was. It's almost like, right, now we're in the serious stuff. These platforms are made for me, and I'm going to show that I belong at the very top level. So big games against Rangers, big games in Europe, Artur Boric was always utterly reliable for us, and he was again that night. And so, Nakamura's free kick is just, has there been a better free kick in the history of that competition? I've not, there's been some, cracking free kick technicians with wands or, for feet. But that free kick, I've never seen one to equal the majesty of that free kick. The whip, the power he gets in the ball. And Big Van der Sar and the Man U goal, God rest him, he's a big unit, and he's nowhere near. He's nowhere. I think he in his desperation to get that ball, he collides with the post. I've never seen a better free kick in my life. And I had my son with me, and it was just, you hear that phrase used, thunderous, when Celtic score in big games, but I've never heard anything like the noise that greeted that goal. Almost equaled a few minutes later when Saha, the United striker, brilliant striker, gets a penalty, and you're thinking, oh, here we go. But as I said, you would back Boric, you would maybe not back him, but you're thinking he's his shot stopping, his penalty saves made you think something could happen here. And of course he saves, and the game's over a couple of minutes later. So probably the last, when did Nakamura score? Was it the 72nd, 73rd minute? But the last 15 from Nakamura's goal to the end, that was probably the most dramatic, thunderous, passionate 15 minutes of any game watching Celtic. Everything. And they were gutted. They were not happy, even though they'd qualified. They're big, important Hollywood players. It doesn't matter if they've qualified. They're made for playing on stages like Celtic Park on a European night. And players like Ronaldo and Rooney and Ferdinand and Paul Scholes don't like to lose in front of theatres like that. It's their professional pride. And they'd thrown everything at Celtic. They'd given everything. And they weren't happy. And I was delighted that they weren't happy, because it kind of showed you. Sometimes I get a bit kind of queasy when everybody's all pals and backslapping and telling us what a brilliant stadium we've got and how brilliant our fans are and what an amazing theatrical occasion it is after scalping us. So it was good. It was good to see that they weren't happy that we'd scalped them.
Absolutely, and I think that probably would go down as a defining result of Celtic in the last maybe post-Seville era in Europe, if it wasn't for, of course, the game against Barcelona with under the Morning. But I think Man U would be maybe level to that, or a very close second anyway, in terms of...
You're so right. But you've got to, when the next big history of Celtic is written, I hope that I hope due prominence is given to what Gordon Strachan gave us, because he took us to that knockout stage, and he took us to the knockout stage the following year. And again, it wasn't the most gifted, magnificent Celtic team you'll ever see, but his tactical awareness, his cleverness, he transmitted to his teams, and I'll be forever grateful to Gordon Strachan for he gave us, under him we got that 1-0 win against Manchester United, and our great performance at Old Trafford. We beat Benfica 3-0 at Parkhead when a certain Kenny Miller scored 2. We beat Copenhagen. We drew with AC Milan in the last 16, and we drew after 90 minutes with Milan in the San Siro, and they beat us in extra time. Kaká, who became the 2007 European Player of the Year, a Brazilian midfielder, and Milan. Milan went on to win. Did they? 2003, 4. Milan went on to win the European Cup that season, beating Liverpool. And that was a mighty Milan team. So those 2 performances we had against Milan, AC Milan, in over 2 legs were amazing. And then the following season we beat AC Milan. We're drawn against them in the group stage. We beat them 2-1. I think it's the only time we've ever beaten AC Milan, home and away. Shakhtar Donetsk, Benfica again, and Barcelona beat us 3-2 at Parkhead and 1-0 in the Nou Camp. So, Celtic's performances in Europe under Gordon Strachan were nothing short of magnificent, astonishing. Well done, the wee man.
Yeah, I think you're right. Strachan is quite underrated, and as we've probably covered a few topics here, we could probably do a whole podcast discussing that as well. I think maybe not the most, as you're saying, flamboyant playing style, but one of the most effective, particularly in European football. And a lot of the teams were rhyming off there. It's, you were beating European champions, Premier League winners, etc., taking Barcelona kind of to the limit, really. Only losing 3-2 at home, and that was a brilliant Barcelona team. Maybe not quite as strong as the one that you went on to play a few years later, but still excellent players in there. They hadn't long won the Champions League as well, and I think they won it a couple of years after that. Messi was coming through, you had Henry, etc. Eto'o, I'm probably forgetting players as well. Deco, Iniesta, Xavi were kind of...
And Henrik Larsson.
Henrik Larsson, of course, yeah.
With Henrik, was that the... We never...
That was a couple of years before, when they actually won it.
When they beat us 3-1 at Parkhead.
An amazing squad. Squad. Yeah. The fact Strachan had Celtic in there competing with these teams, and it was something else. And as you were saying, that Man U game is undoubtedly one of the sort of best. That I unfortunately wasn't there, Kevin. Maybe a bit like when you were discussing about Rangers games, I wasn't allowed to go to that match. I'd been to a few games at that point.
That's making me feel really old, Aidan.
Sorry about that, but I wasn't allowed to go. But I remember watching it on the telly, and it was some occasion, and that free kick by Nakamura and the save by Boric, 2 kind of really top players at that time. Celtic had Nakamura, I believe, is the last Celtic player to be nominated on the shortlist for a Ballon d'Or.
Was that right?
Boric at that time probably was amongst one of the strongest goalkeepers in Europe as well. When he was at his palm, those sort of kind of 3 seasons under Stratton, 05, 06, 06, 07, and then Celtic won the league in 07, 08. That sort of 3-in-a-row run was when Boric was probably at his peak, and he was doing it in Europe. He would obviously go on to play a crucial role against Spartak Moscow in the qualifier the following season as well. So he was phenomenal. So I think you're right to point out that Celtic team maybe wasn't the most technically gifted. A couple of phenomenal players that we've touched on there as well. Also someone like Aidan Macdonald. But over the course, there's probably been better Celtic teams that maybe haven't done as well in Europe since then.
absolutely loved Aidan McGeady. Loved him.
McGeady was a phenomenal player. Obviously, at one time, Celtic's records transfer fee for a good few years. But
Yeah,
yeah, it was a maybe, let I say, maybe not the most technically gifted team, but one of the probably most effective of the modern era, because Strachan was doing it in Europe and domestically at the same time, which is no mean feat when the Rangers team you were competing with at that time as well.
yeah.
But I guess if we move on to the last one, Kevin, the final moment, and it's obviously dates wise, this was the first one as well. It's your first Celtic game, Celtic 5, Hearts 0 in 1969. So I'll let you take the floor with this one.
So yeah, yeah. I suppose everybody must remember their first game. And I've still got, although it was so long ago, there's still some very sharp memories. I think only kind of real Celtic fans will understand that sort of magic that you get as a child, seeing the hoops, the green and white hoops, live for the first time. And back in those days, it was a kind of more monochrome existence. There just wasn't as much colour about. You very rarely got matches in television. Well, certainly if you were 5 or 6, you would never, you wouldn't be allowed up to watch the sports reel, as it was, highlights at 10 and 10:30. And there was nothing like the same level of coverage of football, including Celtic and Rangers, in the newspapers. There was no such thing as digital, online, social media, nothing like that. So your parents and the adults in your life were left to kind of paint the pictures for you in the absence of all that. And being mad Celtic men and women, the pictures they painted were particularly dramatic and vivid and totally exaggerated. So like by the time you turned up at Celtic Park for your first ever game as a 5-year-old, you've had it hammered into you that this team have got special powers, like they've got divine powers. They're God's team. They were basically created in the image and likeness of God, and they were there doing God's work. They were there to basically, they're not just a football team, they're like an instrument of salvation and purity and innocence and goodness. So you get taken along to your first game, you're almost dying. You're almost passing out with the excitement of actually seeing these guys whom you've only heard described in those terms, when you're seeing them in front of you wearing those amazing hoops, right? And that kind of particular sort of shade of green, mesmerizing. And I don't remember a hell of a lot about the actual game. I do remember I was wearing a kind of a coat that my gran had bought me. I'd got a Celtic tammy that my dad got me because he didn't like scarves, because he associated scarves with a kind of a certain kind of a kind of more wild section of the Celtics. It was only hooligans had the scarves, right? But well brought up boys wore tammies. That was a more kind of understated. And there wasn't any gold or yellow. It was just strictly green and white, because he didn't agree with the extra colour. And then the other thing was just the kindness of strangers. So, we'd have become known to some of the kind of adults in the seats round about. My mum and dad didn't have a lot of money, so normally it was very, very rarely thereafter that we would go to the stand, because there was only the only seats were in the main stand. But because this was my first game, he pushed the boat out and got a couple of tickets for the stand. So the adults round about soon became known that this was this gentleman, and he, my dad knew a few of them, This was his boy. This was his first game, his Celtic debut. And so, I can remember all the kindness of these blokes, ruffling your hair, sticking 10 pence or a shilling into your hand. Don't tell your dad. And your dad doing that sort of performative. No, don't bother. Keep it. Don't give him it. No, don't you tell your dad. And then also walking to the game with him, you kind of become aware for the first time of stale alcohol. There's just these alcohol fumes mixed with what you would later realize was urine, cigarette smoke. So there's this kind of beer coming out of cans, spilling at the pavement. So there's this kind of like cocktail of sights and sounds walking up to Celtic Park that just added to the drama and kind of imbued the memories with an extra kind of resonance. And so sometimes, when I was thinking about that game, and occasionally I have thought about the game, you can revive a sense, you can revive the senses that you felt as a 5-year-old. Even now that I'm 60, I can remember echoes of what I felt like. And all the people that I've met since then, and you say, what was it like at your first game? And they kind of mention some of those memories as well. So yeah, so if I'm spared, no matter how long I'm spared, I'll never forget that first game.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, their first game is that sort of defining moment. And as I imagine pretty much everybody you speak to, the actual details of the game, unless it's maybe a particularly memorable thing like a Celtic Rangers game, for example, like that, it tends to be it's not really about what actually goes on in the pitch. It's round about, the sights, the sounds, as you described, a few colourful things that you've seen or heard. I can imagine on that. But that
then,
game,
and it was also, you also felt a kind of sense of privilege, even looking back, because that team 68, 69 won the treble. And they'd only won the treble once before, which was the 67 season. And so people of my dad's generation will tell you that potentially the kind of 69, 70 team might have been better than the Lisbon Lions. And, they beat better clubs in Europe. It was, and they beat, I think they ended that season by beating Rangers 4-0 in the Scottish Cup final. And just all these wonderful players. I mean, most of the Lisbon Lions were still playing. But my favourite player of that era, but I couldn't tell you if he was playing that game or not, was Harry Hood. I just remember collecting Harry Hood football cards, because we used to have the old football cards with bubble gum inside them, and Harry Hood was our icon. In fact, no, he would have been. Yeah, Harry Hood would probably have played. And so the Harry Hood football card still had him in his Clyde strip, because he'd signed, kind of relatively late previous season. So me and my pal competed to see how many Harry Hood football cards we could get. So it's something like 26 Harry Hood cards in my collection with the elastic band. He would have been my first Celtic hero.
No, that's amazing. And talking about football cards and all that, kind of, even for me, like myself, when I was still younger, that was still very much a thing. It was like match attacks was a thing we had, and you could collect all the players, etc., and things like that. But that's an amazing story, Kevin. The fact you can maybe not remember the actual game, but aspects of the experience so vividly shows that kind of how defining it was. And I guess from there it was kind of just a love affair with Celtic after that, from then onwards.
Totally. Wouldn't have swapped a minute of it.
Well, guys, I think we'll leave that there. There's also been a kind of variety of different moments from Kevin across different eras. Just to go back through to recap, we had Celtic 4, Rangers 2, the title decided on May 1979. Celtic's first leg European Cup quarter-final victory, not semi-final like I said it was earlier, over Real Madrid 1980. The 2-1 win in the Scottish Cup final over Dundee United in the centenary season. Nakamura's free kick as Celtic beat Manchester United 1-0 in 2006. And Kevin's first game, Celtic 5, Hearts 0, 1969. Kevin, thanks very much for joining us, mate. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And guys, for anybody that's interested, the ticker tape down below and in the description of the podcast version of this video is a link to subscribe to the website if it interests you. We offer top quality journalism covering the club you all love. It involves columns from people like Kevin, data analysis from Duco James, Alan Morrison, match reaction from myself, Tony and Ryan, videos and so much more. So get yourself involved, guys, if you haven't already. We will be back to cover the sort of fallout from Celtic v Ross County on the morning briefing. So until then, guys, we'll see you later.